So if you really want to get a handle on the Middle Ages in Europe, you kind of have to look past the huge battles and the famous kings for a minute.
Right. You need to focus on the fundamental wiring of society, how it all actually worked day to day.
Exactly. And that wiring is what we call the feudal system.
That's right. It was the main structure for everything. It wasn't just about politics. It was a whole social contract built on land, loyalty, and labor.
And the key word here is necessity, right? This wasn't some idea a philosopher dreamed up. It happened because things were, well, chaotic.
Incredibly unstable. Large empires had collapsed, and there was no central government to provide security. The feudal system was basically a way to provide protection when no one else could.
It created order by being really, really rigid. The easiest way to think about it is like a pyramid. Everyone had a specific place, and you knew exactly what your duties were.
And for most people, the hard truth is that the class you were born into was the class you were going to die in. Moving up the pyramid was almost impossible.
Okay, so let's break down this pyramid, starting from the very top. We've got the king.
The king, the absolute highest authority. And the key thing to understand about his power is that technically he owned all the land in the country.
All of it.
Every last acre. And his power, he claimed, came directly from God. This was the whole idea of the divine right to rule.
But, how strong is that claim, really, if one of his powerful nobles decides to rebel? I mean, if your power comes from God, why do you still need an army?
That is the central tension of the whole system. The divine claim was the moral argument. It made rebellion not just treason, but a sin. But the practical side of it was that no king could possibly manage all that land by himself.
It's just too much.
Way too much. The logistics were a nightmare. So he had to delegate. And that's the core mechanism of feudalism.
He starts granting these huge chunks of land, which are called fiefs, to his most powerful and loyal nobles.
In exchange for those fiefs, the king gets what he needs most. Protection for the kingdom from invaders, and someone to keep the peace locally. The king's word was law, but he needed those powerful nobles to enforce it.
Which brings us down one level on the pyramid to the lords and nobles.
These are the major players. They get their huge estates directly from the king, and in the language of the time, they become the king's vassals.
A vassal is basically someone who promises to serve a superior, right?
Exactly. And in return for the land, they act as local governors. They run the show from their fortified castles or big manor houses.
And what's their main promise to the king?
It's all tied up in a sacred promise called the Oath of Fealty. This wasn't a casual agreement. It was a very public, very serious ceremony.
This was a formal contract.
A binding contract. They promised loyalty, money when needed, and most importantly, soldiers for the king's army.
Okay, but it gets more complicated, doesn't it? Because a lord who is a vassal to the king can also have his own vassals below him.
Yes, that's a great point. It's a process called subinfeudation. A big lord might take his massive fief and grant smaller pieces of it to lesser nobles or knights.
So you could owe loyalty upwards to the king, but also have people below you who owe loyalty to you.
Precisely. And you can see how that could get messy.
Oh, yeah. What happens if you owe loyalty to two different lords and they go to war with each other?
It was a huge problem. They tried to solve it with the idea of a liege lord, the one person you owed ultimate loyalty to. But in reality, it often led to private wars between nobles.
And to fund all this military obligation, the lords collected taxes from everyone on their land. They were also the local judges handling all the local disputes.
And this is so different from how we think today. Their wealth wasn't really measured in gold. It was measured by how much land they controlled and how many people served them. Land was literally power.
All right, let's move down to the next layer. The professional soldiers. The knights.
The knights are really the backbone of the medieval army. They're from the lower level of the nobility, and they are trained their entire lives for combat on horseback with swords and lances.
And that job was incredibly expensive. I mean, the armor, the war horses, the weapons, that all costs a fortune.
A huge amount. So a lord wouldn't just pay a knight a salary. Instead, he'd give the knight a small fief of his own, maybe a village and some fields, just to cover the costs of being ready for war.
And in return for that land, the knight promised to fight for the lord, usually for a set time, something like 40 days a year.
Yes, and their behavior was supposed to be guided by the code of chivalry.
Which we think of as being romantic, but it was really about practical things like bravery, honor, and most of all, loyalty to your lord.
Absolutely, and they had to stay sharp. So in peacetime, you'd have these big tournaments and mock battles. They weren't just for show, they were constant training.
Okay, so we've got the king, lords and knights. But that's only a tiny fraction of the population.
A very small fraction, maybe 5%, if that. The entire foundation of this pyramid, the part that holds everything else up, is the serf class.
The serfs, they were the vast majority of people, and this is a really important distinction we need to make. Serfs were not slaves.
That's a critical legal point. A slave is property. You can buy and sell a slave. A serf couldn't be sold like that.
But they weren't free either.
Not at all. They were legally bound to the land. This meant you couldn't leave the manor where you were born. You couldn't even get married without the Lord's permission.
So your whole life was tied to one geographical spot, and your main job was just endless farm work.
Backbreaking physical labor. All day, every day, to produce the food that fed everyone else on the estate. Their world was tiny. Most never traveled more than a few miles from home.
So why would anyone agree to this? What did they get out of it?
They got two things. First, the Lord gave them a small strip of land to grow their own food. And second, and this is the big one, he gave them protection.
Protection from bandits, from other invading lords.
Exactly. And in such a violent age, that promise of safety from the Lord's knights was incredibly valuable. For many, that stability was worth the price of their freedom.
It's worth pointing out, though, not everyone was a serf, right? There were some free farmers.
A smaller number, yes. Freemen who rented land and could leave when their lease was up, but they were the minority. The system really ran on serf labor.
Okay, so let's dig into the economy of all this because it's all tied together. The main asset, the core of everything was the fief.
The land. Land was everything. It was the only real source of wealth. So a fief is that piece of land given by a lord to his vassal.
And it's not a gift, right? It's more like a loan.
It's a loan for service. It wasn't permanent property like we have today. If you failed to provide your military service, or if you died without an heir, the land went straight back to the lord.
And the fief wasn't just empty fields.
No, it's the whole package. It included the fields, the forest, the animals, the rivers, and all the serfs living and working on it. You got the entire economic unit.
And the glue holding this deal together was that fealty oath, the ceremony.
The ritual of homage. And this was a very serious, very public event. The vassal would kneel down, put his hands inside his lord's hands, and swear on a holy relic to be his loyal man for life.
And what did that oath commit him to?
The vassal promised military service, he promised to give the lord advice, and he promised financial help for certain big events, like the lord's son becoming a knight.
And the lord's side of the bargain.
The lord promised to treat him fairly, provide justice, and most of all, to defend him. It was supposed to be a two-way street, but breaking that oath was the worst crime you could commit. It was treason.
Let's zoom in on where life actually happened. The manor. This was the basic unit of feudal society.
The manor was basically a self-sufficient village. It had the lord's house or castle, a church, a mill, and the village where the serfs lived in their small huts.
Self-sufficient meaning they made almost everything they needed right there.
Pretty much everything. Food, clothes, fuel from the forest. Long-distance trade had mostly broken down, so each manor was its own little economic world.
And the farming itself, it wasn't very advanced, was it?
No, they used these heavy wooden plows pulled by oxen. But they had a clever system to keep the soil from getting exhausted. It's called three-field rotation.
Right. So explain how that worked.
It was smart for the time. You divide your land into three big fields. In any given year, you plant one with a winter crop like wheat, the second with a spring crop like beans, and you leave the third field completely empty.
You let it rest.
Exactly. You let it lie fallow so it can recover its nutrients. It made a huge difference in how much food they could grow.
Even so, the diet was pretty simple. Lots of bread and beer.
Mostly bread from wheat and rye and ale from barley. Things like peas and beans were really important for protein because meat was a luxury that was usually saved for the lord.
And the toughest part is that most of the food the serfs grew didn't even go to them.
No. A huge portion went to the lord as rent or tax. Then the church took its 10%, the tithe. The serf's family had to survive on whatever was left over. One bad harvest could be a disaster.
So you have this very rigid system. What were the big forces that kept it all going for hundreds of years? The first one seems obvious. Security?
The constant threat of war was the ultimate justification for it all. The hierarchy provided a clear military command structure. You knew who was supposed to protect you.
And the symbol of that protection was the stone castle.
The castle, yeah. They were incredibly hard to attack, and they were a safe place for people to run to when there was trouble.
And the other major force propping the system up was the church.
The Christian church was a superpower. It wasn't just about religion, it was a political and economic force.
And it provided the moral justification for the whole thing.
It did. The church taught that the social order, king on top, serfs on the bottom, was created by God. Resisting your place in society was like resisting God's will.
And the church itself was a major landowner. Bishops and abbots were often powerful lords in their own right, with their own vassals and knights.
They had incredible wealth and power. They collected the tithe, and they controlled society's moral laws from birth to death. That spiritual authority was a huge part of what kept the system stable.
But no system lasts forever. What started to break the feudal pyramid apart?
It wasn't one single thing. It was a combination of major shocks to the system. The first was the slow return of cities and trade.
Right. Towns start to grow again, and they create a different way of life.
A way of life not based on farming. You could be a craftsman or a merchant. And towns offered something incredible to serfs: freedom.
There was a rule, right? If you could escape and live in a town for a certain amount of time.
A year and a day. If a serf could escape the manor and live in a town for a year and a day without being caught, they were legally free. That was a huge incentive to leave.
And then came the biggest shock of all in the 1300s. The Black Death.
The plague. It was a demographic catastrophe. It killed, what, maybe a third to a half of the entire population of Europe?
And suddenly labor, which had been cheap and everywhere, was incredibly rare.
It completely flipped the economy on its head. The surviving serfs suddenly had immense power.
They could demand better wages?
Higher wages,
Better
working conditions, more rights. Lords were desperate for workers. If your lord said no, you could just walk away and go to the next manor over, where the lord would probably agree to your terms. The old bond to the land was shattered.
At the same time, the military was changing. Kings started to want their own armies.
Exactly. Kings started using tax money to hire professional soldiers, mercenaries who fought for cash, not for land.
So the king didn't need to rely on his nobles and their knights as much anymore.
Right, and that shifted power away from the lords and back to the central government, back to the crown.
And finally, technology. New weapons start making the old ways of war obsolete.
The longbow, which could punch through a knight's armor, and early cannons that could knock down castle walls. The two main symbols of feudal power, the knight and the castle, were suddenly much less effective.
So when you look back, the whole feudal system was a very specific solution for a very dangerous time. It was a contract built on land and loyalty, and it provided stability.
It did. But when the economy changed, when a plague created a labor shortage, and when new technology arrived, that rigid structure just couldn't adapt. It crumbled.
And in its place, a new system based on money, trade, and centralized kingdoms began to rise. The world we'd recognize today started to take shape.
A foundational shift, really. It set Europe on the path to becoming what it is now.
That's a huge amount to take in, but that's what you find when you start to look at the structures that hold up different periods of history.
Absolutely. Good luck with your studies.